Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of deportations in the United States. My guest for this is Adam Goodman. Adam Goodman is a professor of Latin American and Latino Studies and History at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is the author of the book, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants. Adam Goodman, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Hi, Mitch. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Let me just begin in the present moment and ask you, how do you see the Donald Trump presidency in the story, in the narrative that you give about the history, some 140-year history of deportations in the United States?
Yeah, I think that Donald Trump fits squarely into a much longer history of mass expulsion from the United States, which I track back to the late 19th century when the federal government gained control over immigration enforcement. And that's a history that includes the deportation of more than 60 million people since the 1880s up until the present. And this is a bipartisan history in which Republicans and Democrats alike have sought to force people out of the country or coerce people into leaving, or scare people into picking up and leaving without ever coming into contact with any immigration authority. And, one of the things that I realized while conducting research for my book and since is that during the last century or so, the United States has expelled more people than it's allowed to remain in the country on a permanent basis, which leads me to the question that begins the book, and that's what kind of nation is the United States? Often thought of as a nation of immigrants, it also goes hand in hand with a story of exclusion, restriction, and deportation. So it's both the nation of immigrants in one sense and also a deportation nation at the same time.
So you don't see Donald Trump and his presidency as a break from history and sort of how the United States has approached immigration. Do you see it as an intensity of it? Do you see a difference at all when it comes to Donald Trump in history?
What I don't want to do is, give you the sense that Donald Trump represents more of the same. I do think that there are important ways in which he has really turned up the volume and sought to ramp up the anti-immigrant sentiment and xenophobia to great political effect, for his own political gain, that is. And that's a tried and true method that different people have used throughout history. But, he in particular in the recent past, stands apart. And we don't know what's coming during the second Trump administration. We do know that things are going to be bad for immigrants and immigrant communities and people who care about them and live alongside them and work alongside them. I think, one of the things that we should emphasize as well from the beginning is that, in all of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that we've heard from the president-elect and also from the media, who oftentimes repeats, this rhetoric without really critically interrogating it. It's almost as if you can easily separate immigrants from non-immigrants, people who are undocumented from people who have legal permanent status, from people who are U.S. citizens. That's not how the world works. That's not how our society and our country are organized. These incoming policies, which will wreak havoc on immigrant communities, will also be really detrimental to U.S. citizens and people in the country with legal status as well. And so we should think about that. And I think that's something that we've seen throughout history, and we've seen the real costs, on real people, our family members, and our loved ones, our coworkers, the children who are in school, alongside our own children, etc.
One of the slogans we hear from Trump and his supporters and people that he is selecting to fill his cabinet and other positions in the administration is America First. America first, and I feel like this hasn't been it hasn't been interrogated enough about what that term means, America first, and the history of that term, America first. There was an American First movement, American First Committee, sort of during World War II, which, if you do some investigation into it, you see that was considered a fascist group in the United States during sort of World War II in the 1940s and that period of time. Is the America First going back in history on your radar when it comes to sort of the treatment and the attitudes towards immigrants in this country?
I think there's almost another parallel that might be more fitting in that sense, or in that regard, to the World War I era, a century ago. Again, to where, we had mass immigration from China, mass immigration from Japan, and especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, and increasingly so from Mexico. But immigrants, as a percentage of the overall population, reached around 14%, in the 19 teens. That's roughly what it is now. It hasn't reached a similar level in the past century, but there's some kind of echo there historically. And also the buildup of xenophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric and the scapegoating of immigrants for political gain and racism directed at immigrant communities. It was another kind of echo we hear. And I think that one of the things that makes it so effective, both then and now, is that people have real needs. People are suffering and hurting economically, and politicians pick up on that and scapegoat immigrants as the reason why people are suffering. And that's not the case. Immigrants are not the cause of the suffering, but they're an effective scapegoat, and much easier to point the finger at them than to actually address the problems, underlying people's hardships.
Tell me more about what's happening in World War I era, during the World War I era.
Well, there's a lot of fear about different people who have different political beliefs and who are political radicals, anarchists and socialists from Southern and Eastern Europe, in addition to people who have been coming and pushing out workers from jobs. So Chinese labor, which in the late 19th century was seen as in direct competition by many other immigrant communities, including the Irish immigrants, who are moving west to work in mines and to work on the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad. Immigrant groups pitted themselves against one another and pushed for exclusionary policies and used politicians, to try to achieve those goals and to protect their communities. And this is something that we see in World War I era in the 19 teens, really picking up what at that point was decades of pressure to cut down on immigration, and the fact that there was such dramatic demographic change in the country in the late 19th and early 20th century eventually leads to the passage of a series of acts in the 19 teens, 1920s, culminating in the 1924 Immigration Act, oftentimes thought of as the National Origins Quota Act. And what that did was drastically restricted who could come to the United States. By that point, most people from Asia were barred from entering. They created what was called the Asia Barred Zone. It didn't allow people who are laborers to come. Some people still were able to make it in around those quotas and around those restrictions, but usually people of means, people who had economic standing. And it also dramatically reduced those from Southern and Eastern Europe. So places like Russia or Soviet Union, Poland, Italy, Greece, and elsewhere. And so this is a time when immigrants were seen as a threat, a fundamental threat to the fabric of the nation. And these movements of kind of America First and America for Americans really pick up steam. Now, the fact that there was a war, this war of global proportion also mattered a great deal. We see that there's a tie or connection between national security concerns and people coming from other countries being seen as a perceived threat or a potential threat. And I think that's something there's echoes of as well throughout the past century. But this really restrictionist draconian act passed in 1924 led to a dramatic reduction and who could come to the United States in the decades ahead, to the point where immigrants as a percentage of the population went from 14% in the 19 teens to about 5% by 1970. And since then, because of changes in law, that's increased again. And I think we're seeing kind of the effects and impact of that now in the current presidency of Joe Biden, but also moving into the second Trump term.
That's very interesting. From 5% or from 14%, I think is what you said, to 5% after.
And now back up to around 14.
And now back up to around 14.
Yes.
And this is the 1924 Immigration Act. That would be the law of the land to what? The 1964 Immigration Act?
1965.
65 Immigration Act.
Yeah, there's some other acts passed in the interim, but it's not until 1965 that another Immigration Act under the guise of civil rights policy passed during the administration of Lyndon B. Johnson eliminates the national origins quotas. But something I should have mentioned about the 1924 Act is that it did not apply to the Western Hemisphere. So it didn't apply to immigrants coming from Mexico or from the Caribbean, for that matter. And what happens is that once most of the migration is limited from Asia and from Southern and Eastern Europe, which had been supplying the labor that was much needed during that time, employers started looking more and more south to Mexico for their supply of labor. So that labor demand, and also the geographic proximity, obviously, of Mexico and the United States, leads to an increase in Mexican migration during the course of the middle of the 20th century. In addition to programs like the temporary guest worker program, sometimes referred to as the Bracero program, which happened from 1942 to 1964. But in 1965, a few things happened. The Bracero program ends, no longer allowing people from Mexico to come to the United States with legal status, albeit temporary and albeit under exploitative conditions. And also the 1965 Immigration Act, which does away with the national origins quotas, liberalizing immigration policy in that sense, puts the first ever cap on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. So we have the first ever cap on immigration from the Western Hemisphere is under the 1965 Act. And this is kind of the punitive side of the act that people hadn't known as much about until recent work by scholars has focused on this and looked at how the combination of these factors led to fewer opportunities for Mexicans who had been coming to the United States for decades at this point to do so through legal channels. Unsurprisingly, people continued to migrate because they had jobs, because they had family, because they had created these transnational lives in many cases. However, now they were considered to be undocumented or unauthorized. So it's in part this crucial moment in 1965 that does away with the national origins quotas, but also would create the fundamental conditions politically and in terms of policy that would lead to the large growth of the undocumented population in the country.
So before 1924, before this Immigration Act of 1924, the public discussion about immigration was really focused on Eastern and Central Europeans and Asians.
Southern, yes.
Southern Europeans and Asians, especially Chinese. After 1924, that source of migration coming from these places is basically closed down, and is it after the 1924 Act in which the United States starts to really pay attention to Mexicans here?
Increasingly so, although during the 19-teens, I uncovered evidence in the National Archives and from other sources that immigration agents were really targeting Mexicans alongside Chinese on the U.S.-Mexico border, in part because there was a guest worker program created during World War I. There's labor demand, or some people have argued that employers wanted to have a labor surplus to exert more control over the labor. But it's really after 1924 and then moving ahead that immigration officials increasingly focus their attention on Mexican migrants. And it's no coincidence that although although the Western Hemisphere was not included in the national origins quota restrictions as a way to appease the congressmen who are pushing for broader restrictions, but didn't get them, 1924 is also the same year that the Border Patrol is created to target people moving across the territorial borders between the United States and Mexico and the United States and Canada. So this is really a crucial moment of change, and one that, moving ahead, leads to what we have now, which is roughly 20,000 Border Patrol agents in the United States, 18,000 of which are stationed on the U.S.-Mexico border.
The United States government doesn't really get involved in immigration enforcement, or at least maybe deportations. You can clarify this for me until the 1890s. What's happening in the 1890s?
Well, in part, it's some of what we've been discussing. The increase in labor migration generally from China, is seen as a real issue that the federal government should address, and that states hope that they would address, and that different immigrant communities pressured local politicians and state politicians to address. It's also a period of time of a series of consequential Supreme Court cases, that solidifies the federal government's power over immigration, and saying that it's nation states, it's the federal state that should be able to determine who's allowed to come and enter the country and who's allowed to remain. Now, this is part of a much broader global hardening of borders around this same time. There's an excellent book, if people are interested in reading more, by the late historian Adam McCune, called Melancholy Order, which talks about the globalization of borders and the creation of passport systems. But it's really, at this moment in time, when the world that we come to understand in the later decades comes into being, and that borders are hardening. You now need identifications, national identifications, to cross borders, and you have an increasing federal bureaucracy that's growing exponentially on multiple fronts, and that certainly includes immigration. It would only increase in the decades ahead, as we mentioned earlier, in relation to questions of national security and who's coming into the country, and the potential or perceived threat that they might pose.
This is a modern thing. The idea of borders, even states, are modern.
Correct.
Yeah,
that's right. These are historically contingent. They have not always existed as we know them today.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Adam Goodman, who is a professor of Latin American and Latino Studies and History at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is the author of the book, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants. Another term we're hearing used a lot right now by Donald Trump and his supporters and people that will serve for him in his administration is harking back to what happened in the 1950s in this country, a Dwight D. Eisenhower era program known as, and this is a derogative, but this is what it was called. Maybe this is where the term comes from, Operation Wetback. What was Operation Wetback?
The mass expulsion campaign in the 1950s, known as Operation Wetback, as you said, which is a derogatory term, a racial slur, that needs to be used and understood in that context. So I'm glad you prefaced that as such.
Is that where the term comes from, or did the term exist as a pejorative?
It was
before?
Very prevalent around that time in the early in the mid 20th century, especially because people who crossed the border in the Texas borderlands would cross the river, the Rio Grande, and they'd emerge on the other side, come into the United States, with their clothes wet, which is what the term is drawn from.
So they called it Operation Wetback as it was already this derogatory term.
It was already a derogatory term, but it's worth mentioning that if you look in the historical record, whether it's the federal government archives, or you look at any mainstream media source really at that time, they were using that term in common usage. It's commonly accepted, which in and of itself is troubling, to say the least. But this was a mass expulsion campaign based on fear and fear-mongering, based on scapegoating, and many of the things that we've been discussing already, in which the federal government set out to expel as many Mexican laborers in the country as possible. It ends up being hundreds of thousands of people who are caught up in this operation. But I think that many people don't really understand how the operation worked on the ground. And that was one of the things I was able to uncover in the research I did. And part of what I realized as I got deeper into the research was that most people in the United States don't understand the history of deportation, and that they only think of it as when a judge, and it's kind of imagined immigration judge, orders someone out of the country after a hearing and a legal process in which their case has been adjudicated. That's not how around 90%, 85% or 90% of people have been expelled from the country throughout the last century and a half. Most people have been deported through expedited means in which they've received little to no due process and had little, if any, chance to fight to stay in the country. And these have been coercive campaigns that have summarily rounded up Mexicans in particular, but many others as well. And this 1950s expulsion campaign is a prime example of how this worked in practice. So even before the mass roundups started in the middle of June 1954, there was a publicity campaign leading up to it, which was meant to spark people to leave kind of on their own, what becomes known later as self-deportation. Right? You never come into contact with an immigration official. You just decide that things are so bad and life is so difficult in the place where I'm living that I'm going to leave preemptorily, I guess.
Fear,
or
right?
preemptively.
People are experiencing fear, and people always leave if they feel. I mean, if they can leave,
if they can. And the reality is that not that many people did, but this was part of the campaign that proved crucial and critical in places like Chicago, where I live now, where more people left kind of in response to this fear campaign than were actually apprehended and deported. But most of the people who were removed during the campaign were from California, Texas, other places across the West Coast and Southwest.
It begins in California.
Sorry?
It begins in California?
It begins in California in the middle of June 1954. It moves to Texas and then later moves to Chicago. I should mention as well that these mass roundups happened, and they included people who had legal status in the United States. They included people who are U.S. citizens, even in some cases, based on large or widespread racial profiling. But let's also recognize that not everyone, including conservative business people in Texas in particular, wanted the federal government to come and take undocumented people who had served as essential labor in their communities. And I found a folder or two of letters in the National Archives of outraged farmers and growers in South Texas who wrote to President Eisenhower and his wife, Mamie Eisenhower, complaining about the Border Patrol's presence in their communities and taking away their laborers who had been there for, in some cases, years, and going as far as to compare the Border Patrol agents to Gestapo and to Nazis, and telling the Border Patrol agents, why don't you come and pick the cotton yourselves if you're going to take away our much needed labor? Which is just a reminder that the politics of immigration, as we think of them today, and the partisan nature, hasn't always been that way either. There's been dramatic shifts and changes over time. But this is the campaign that that Trump has used to great effect to say that we'll carry out what will be even larger and more consequential deportation operation than President Eisenhower in the 1950s. It's thought of as the largest deportation campaign ever. In part, that was publicity. In part, that was kind of smoke that the Border Patrol and Immigration Service wanted to blow in order to gain more congressional appropriations and to celebrate all of their so-called accomplishments. And I don't think it's a mistake that the president-elect was also comparing himself to a World War II war hero.
Where does this campaign come from in before the creation that led to the creation of, again, a derogatory term, but it's what it was called, Operation Wetback? And did Eisenhower run for re-election on the issue of immigration?
Well, I mean, one of the things to remember is that, this was really important, obviously, at the time, and it was very consequential. It was national news. But it was one of many things that was happening, during these early years of the Cold War as well, the Korean War as well, had ended, soon not too long before, I guess, this campaign took off. So it was one of many things that was happening at the time. But in terms of immigration, it really was incredibly consequential, because ultimately the goal that federal officials had was to push Mexican laborers out of the country, but also into the Bracero program, into this temporary guest worker program. So what we see is that there is a reduction of the undocumented population in the country, but many people came back either through the Bracero program or without authorization, and that's something that never changed, was the demand for Mexican labor, as well as the many connections that Mexican people had to the United States, since they had been coming for, at that time, years, decades, or even generations.
I just want to underscore and underline and really focus for a moment on the role that fear plays in all of this. Last week, I interviewed Pedro Rios, who's an immigrant rights activist in San Diego, talking about how people are preparing for the Trump presidency. And one thing was clear, he said, if you are undocumented in this country, you don't give people your information. You don't tell them things. I mean, he told me the whole thing that they're telling folks to do. And just, it was clear how much fear was being felt in the community. And then, we all know the consequences of just fear of itself, especially when it comes to, I just started thinking about something I've been paying more attention of late, as for personal reasons, childhood trauma. And I just started thinking about the children who are here, who are scared, and the trauma this causes, and most likely children who are going to be here 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. I mean, this is inducing, I'm assuming, trauma on children now, and always has.
Yeah, that's without a doubt. And it is incredibly disturbing, and certainly not, I think, what any sensible immigration policy should be based on, is punishment and trauma, essentially. And that's something that we see across time. People who are greatly affected, even if they themselves are not apprehended and deported. But fear has always been an essential part of these mass expulsion campaigns, and I think we see in the lead up to this next administration, it's been essential. So I'd been, I guess, contacted frequently this past summer and fall, by members of the media who are interested in learning more about the history of deportation, and they're wondering what's going to happen, and will Trump actually be able to deport all the people in the country who don't have legal status? And I came to realize that people were missing kind of the boat, in the sense that the campaign's already started through the fear that's being propagated, and through the promises, the outlandish promises, whether or not he can succeed or not. We know that things are going to be challenging and difficult, and we know that the fear is part of the plan. And so, as you say, people are organizing already, just as they have in the past. And that's another really crucial piece of the story that I tell, are the stories of organizing and activism, and people who are fighting against these inhumane policies. And that's has an equally long history, which we should emphasize. It's not just one of people going along with these just really abhorrent policies that have used immigrants as scapegoats and demonized them, and really created, I think, harmful ideas of belonging, and who is and who is not a U.S. citizen, who is and who is not an American.
I'm going to pivot to that resistance here in just a moment, but I want to follow up on what's happening in the 1950s and these great mass deportations that are occurring. You document very closely what they actually look like, especially in the act of taking people out of the United States, putting them on cargo ships. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so for a couple of years in the latter part of the 1950s, U.S. immigration officials, in collaboration with Mexican authorities and private Mexican companies, in addition to some private U.S. companies, deported tens of thousands of people across the Gulf of Mexico on cargo ships that were designed and meant to carry produce, bananas, for example, that were taken from the Mexican state of Tabasco to states in the U.S. South like Alabama, and then on the return trip these privately owned Mexican cargo ships would pick up a group of deportees, 500 people, 800 people, depending on the ship, from Port Isabel, Texas, in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and then take them across the Gulf down to Veracruz, further away from the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, what this really was an attempt at prevention through deterrence, is what we later come to think of it as, an effort by U.S. officials to make the conditions on these ships and to make the experience of deportation so miserable and so challenging that people would decide not to return to the United States in the future. If that doesn't happen, we know that if people do return, there's many factors that influence and affect people's decisions. But the conditions on these ships, people liken them sometimes to 17th and 18th century slave ships. The food was rancid. The conditions were just really inhumane. They were not built for humans to travel on them, but they're humans. In this case, Mexican migrants were thought of as human cargo, not just by U.S. officials, but by Mexican officials and business people as well. So there's an important class dimension, class dynamic to this story. And eventually this operation ends after there's a mutiny aboard one of these ships, where people jump overboard, and it becomes a national, international news story, and it's no longer tenable for the Mexican government to support this operation. So it ends. But that's not to say that the punitive tactics used to deport people stops. And that's something we know that continues in various forms, really in the decades since.
Can you tell me more about the mutiny?
The mutiny, what we know is that there are a number of individuals who jumped overboard on these ships when it was nearing Tampico, which is a little less than halfway, perhaps, on the trip from Port Isabel to Veracruz. Really tragically, some people died after jumping overboard. They were not able to make it to shore, and their remains were later found, identified in some cases by the Levi's jeans that they were wearing. But this, for understandable reasons, I guess, becomes really a flashpoint, and Mexican officials now kind of backtrack and try to go back on their support for the operation. But if you look at the archival record, the Mexican officials were very much in favor of this operation, in the ways in which they described Mexican migrants. I think people would find equally abhorrent as the rhetoric used by the U.S. officials. So in this case, this operation was just one example, but we can really see the ways in which the business of deportation and the necessity to deport mass numbers of people relied on physical, psychological harm, and also material costs. So profits, really drove this operation, in addition to domestic and foreign politics. But there's these perverse economic incentives that are still around today in different forms, which people have probably followed in part through the stories about the private detention facilities. But I should emphasize it's not just the private industries and businesses that are benefiting, that are driving these operations. It's also the public imperative. And this is something that we really see the policies creating the opportunities for. So as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, it's the policies that created a market in deportable people and turned this into a business. If the policies were different and people could come to the United States, through legal means or regularize their status after some conditions were met, then they wouldn't be subject to these, horrific experiences.
So it's a bad look. People are learning, and it's being covered. People are learning about people are being deported on these ships that are, jumping off the ships. Many of them drowning. This is a catalyst for the end of this, for ending this program.
That's how the program essentially ends. 50,000 people later, and roughly 75 trips on these boats, which carried again between 500 and 800 people. The vast majority were men, although roughly 10% from some of the ship logs and records I identified were women and children, some entire families. So this wasn't just a story of single male laborers, which wouldn't make it any less horrifying, but it's important to understand kind of the demographic context as well, and the different ways and the different people that U.S. officials targeted in collaboration with Mexican officials and private industry.
Adam Goodman is our guest. He is the author of the book, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants. Let's turn now to, and I think it's safe to say there has always been resistance to what has been happening, dating for the last century. But it's really in the 1970s, isn't it, when we start to see the rise of something we would recognize today as an immigrant rights movement?
Yeah, as you point out, I mean, people have been organizing and engaged in activism, long before the 1970s. But I think we start to see both the current dynamics on the enforcement side as well as on the resistance side in the 1970s. I refer to this time as the dawn of the age of mass expulsion. It's really the time in which, because of increasing presence of immigration officials in communities across the country, deportation, or the possibility of deportation, becomes a fact of everyday life for many undocumented people, and some people here with legal status as well. And in response to that, in response to the fact that an average of 900,000 people per year are deported, starting in the late 1970s and really going to the present, with some fluctuations year to year.
Is this where we get sort of what we recognize today as raids?
There were mass immigration raids happening all the time in the 1970s. And this is something that I document extensively, including one particular raid at a shoe factory outside of Los Angeles, and in the San Gabriel Valley in the town of El Monte. And there's a shoe factory there in which, in May 1978, a group of around 40 immigration agents descended on the factory, surrounded all of the exits, closed them off, and went in and lined everyone up, lined up all the workers, and just based on broad racial profiling, hauled them down to their downtown Los Angeles headquarters at the federal building. And they were going to be on their way back to Mexico for deportation through these voluntary departures, because they were pressured to sign these forms agreeing to leave the country, or be threatened with much harsher consequences, including an indefinite time in detention while their cases played out. And a group of workers are boarding the buses to head to the border. And what happens that day is that the buses never make it to the border, because in the background, behind the scenes, a coalition of labor organizers, immigration lawyers, immigrants themselves, and people who were involved in resistance work had filed an injunction in federal court, and a judge had approved that and prevented their deportation. So the buses have to circle back. And this case plays out over the course of the next 14 years. The long story short is that many of the people were able to win their cases. They're able to have their deportation stayed, and they are not forced to leave the country. And there's also a major class action lawsuit that's won that led to the victory, in the sense that immigration officials would now have to inform undocumented people of their rights, according to the Constitution, when they were encountering them and apprehending them. And that was something that started with a group of 60 workers or so that fought their cases, that led to that class action suit, which affected more than 1 million people in the country at the time. So that's one story of many. But yeah, immigration raids are happening across urban areas and in some rural areas, agricultural areas, in which hundreds, sometimes thousands of people are rounded up. So in 1982, just to give one other example, there's something called Operation Jobs, which is really a publicity effort, to say that, look what we're doing to crack down on immigration and the immigrant workers who are supposedly taking the jobs of U.S. citizens who are desperate to have them, although that wasn't the case. In which, in a single week in 1982, 6,000 people are rounded up in a series of mass raids. So, what the incoming administration is promising, has a long history. And also, in response, just as people are doing now to organize and to plan, that has an equally long history. And, that that counterweight and that pushback from the community, and people looking at ways to transcend kind of the conventional definitions of belonging. I think that's an important piece of the story that we need to really put front and center, and not just feel impotent or that it's doom and gloom all the time.
It seems impossible to deport all undocumented immigrants from the country. It may not even be the actual plan. I mean, am I wrong in our conversation to start seeing this as kind of a PR campaign to try to make people's lives miserable?
Right. No, I think it was an electoral strategy above all. It's not to say that the president-elect and the people around him don't actually believe in what they're saying and would like to actually carry out these policies, but I don't think it's logistically or economically feasible. I don't think it's politically feasible either. I mean, I think we'll see what happens. No one knows exactly what's going to happen. As I mentioned, we know things will be challenging and difficult and horrible, and there'll be real human costs in the interim, depending on what happens. But there will be organizing, there will be activism, there will be resistance, and I think people will be outraged if they start seeing, again, the guy who owns the cafe down the street that's been there for 25 years and that you see every day when you go and get your coffee, who's apprehended and deported, or your classmate at the university, your neighbor. I mean, there's some people who are here with legal status and programs like temporary protected status or TPS or DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, that have been here for decades or most of their lives in many cases. It's not going to be so easy, to remove those people from the communities in which they are ingrained, in which they play an essential role, just like anyone else.
I keep thinking about Donald Trump's first term as president. I think, if not on the first day, I can't quite remember, the first couple of days, in his travel ban, and how that spurred people across the country to turn up at airports in protest. It was this really dramatic moment. I can't say right now I feel that same energy out there, but maybe things change if people do start seeing people they know, seeing their neighbors.
I think detained. That's right. I mean, there's been a different response post-election this time, and at least in the lead up to inauguration. But I also agree with you that depending on what happens, depending on what we see, we might see people mobilized, organized, and really calling and insisting that the policies being carried out stop immediately. There's ways in which it's very helpful to have a common enemy for people. And the Trump administration, for people who care about immigration, I think serves as that, or serves in that role to potentially organize and activate and mobilize people. So there could be kind of, a silver lining perhaps, is that people will become politicized in ways that they haven't been before, and that there might be actually, an opportunity for people to, en masse, push for, broader changes that would pull things back in the other direction, from this really restrictionist, anti-immigrant rhetoric and, set of policies that we've seen implemented in recent years by both Republicans and Democrats, and that, are likely, coming in the next administration. You
do seem to see in history the pendulum go back and forward. I feel like we sort of see that when it comes to immigration and the discourse about immigration. You have the 1964 or 1965 Immigration Act that undid the quotas, but like you said, sort of often forgot, put the sort of the cap now on the Western Hemisphere, particularly Mexico and Latin America, but still largely sort of seen as an easing of strict immigration policies from the 1924 Act. Then we get the 1996 Immigration Act. Which way is and this is the Bill Clinton presidency, which way is the pendulum swinging with the 1996 Immigration Act?
Yes, the 1996 Immigration Act, which is the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, is one of the most, I think, harmful policies for immigrants in the last half century, if not longer, maybe. signed again, as you say, by Democrat Bill Clinton. And to an extent, I feel like we are in this moment where they're kind of living a 1990s redux, where we're seeing the Democrats come around to some pretty punitive policies and some harsh policies that 4 years ago they would never have even gotten near.
I remember being in college during Proposition 187 in California in the 1990s. I was at San Francisco State University thinking to myself, well, this is never going to pass because no one here seems to like it. And it ends up passing by like 2/3. And it was sort of like the first, right, of this new era of incredibly harsh immigration measures.
Yeah, and that's something that I think we've seen in terms of the shifting policy and rhetoric of the Democrats in the last 4 years. Such that their immigration policy is essentially during this past election cycle and the campaign was complaining about how Trump had spiked this border bill and this deal that they had agreed upon, which 4 years ago they never would have supported, and 20 years ago George W. Bush never would have supported because it would have been too extreme. And things have really moved to the restrictionist side of the ledger in recent years, and I think that's in part because of the outlandish policies that Trump has proposed and made, really draconian measures seem palatable and potentially viable. And I think that the Democrats have really faltered in not staking out some new ground on immigration. And this is really an opportunity to do so. Perhaps they will, but if history is a guide, they won't. But to really differentiate themselves from the Trump administration, from the Republicans, rather than kind of blowing in the wind according to whatever the pollsters are telling them, they could actually stake out, some ground here in defending immigrants and defending the long histories of the United States as being a place that people have continued to come to, despite the harsh policies that we've been discussing today. People have continued to come for various reasons, and we have an incredibly diverse, rich country in so many ways because of people who have decided to join the nation. And not everyone necessarily is going to agree with that, but I think the Trump campaign in 2024 showed that even if you don't agree with him on immigration, you might vote for him for other reasons. And Democrats could do the same. If they're fearful about losing voters because of a pro-immigrant policy, I would say, well, you need to win the voters over on other issues and stick with your immigration policy that actually has, some kind of, moral and political value and weight, rather than moving from one side to the other time and again, which people don't, I think, respect and ultimately doesn't resonate.
I mean, it just feels like we're living once again through another anti-immigrant moment in time. There's resistance to it. There certainly is resistance to it, and we'll see it, and we'll see how this plays out. I have one last question I meant to ask earlier, but I do think it's important, and we only have a couple minutes left, but we are hearing that the Trump team is now currently thinking of what kind of health risk can they peg on immigrants in order to be able to really shut down the border the way it did in the pandemic. This isn't a new dynamic, is it? Using health risks to restrict immigration.
No, there's a long history of that as well. And I think it just, more broadly points to the fact that they're looking at any kind of tools that they can pull out to help them achieve their larger goals when it comes to undocumented immigration and cracking down on it, but also legal immigration, limiting the number of people who are able to come into the United States through whatever means. And, we saw this in the pandemic, through the Title 42 policy that resulted in mass expedited expulsions, which fits into a pattern that we've seen now for many decades. But I wouldn't be surprised moving forward if we see some similar efforts that'll get caught up in the courts among a much broader array of policies that they're going to rely on, now having some experience from the first term, to see how they can most effectively and quickly implement these policies. And the last thing I would just say to circle back very briefly is that you refer to the pendulum kind of swinging from the restrictionist side to kind of more pro-immigrant sentiment. And I would just add that it's not as if that happens on its own. It's because people who are engaging in these struggles and fighting to make it so. I just want to emphasize that here as we wind down. It's because people are are making history. They're not waiting for something to happen or waiting for it to swing back in the other direction.
Adam Goodman is a professor of Latin American and Latino studies and history at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is the author of the book called The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants. And he has joined us for a conversation about the history of deportations in this country. Adam Goodman, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mitch.